Hi, welcome to today's sew along. I'm going to be making the Birchgrove pants today, and I'm going to be making it out of this really nice tencel. I will say that tencel is not the easiest thing to sew, so if this is your very first project ever, then maybe tencel wouldn't be the best thing to try. It's very slippery and it can induce a lot of swearing in my experience anyway. So maybe if you've bought some beautiful tencel, then just put it aside and do it for the next project. And a great beginner fabric for this pattern would be a linen. A beautiful linen would make fantastic pants, and it's really easy to sew. So I have determined which is the right and wrong side, which, to be honest, wasn't the easiest. And I've done a couple of cheats here because when I got this fabric home, I realized that it actually wasn't a full 150 centimeters or 60 inches wide. It was just a little bit narrower. So this is the waistband piece, and I've actually had to seam that together. There's another cheat that I did that I'll show you in just a second. So I've determined that this is the right side of my fabric and this is the wrong side. So the right side's a little bit more textured looking. So that's the waistband. I've got everything else cut out as well. The other reason that I don't like tencel is it creases like crazy. So here's the other cheat that I did. Like I was saying, it didn't have quite enough fabric, so I cut these pieces on the cross grain, and it's not going to matter because they'll be completely unseen. You just have to kind of be aware of, once you understand about the construction of a garment, you'll know when it matters, when you can cheat and when you can't cheat. So definitely if it's your first one, try not to cheat. And also, especially with this texture, the texture goes very clearly in one direction. So it would be quite obvious if this were a piece that would be seen. So we're actually going to start off using these pieces. The other thing that I have is this twill tape. Now, this is very, very fine. Hope you can see that. It's not going to add any bulk at all. So it's quite different to the kind of decorative twill tape that you would see, that kind of thick, often kind of cream color stuff. It's very fine compared to that. It doesn't have to have the twill. You just need something very stable. And this is a cotton tape, and I really do like it for stabilizing things. It just ensures that basically your seams won't go anywhere if you're stabilizing something. Okay. So I'm just going to put the back pieces aside here. Okay, here are my front pieces, I think. Yes. Okay, so like I said, I'm determining which way's the right way. And of course now I'm second guessing myself. I think that this is the right side. Let's just double check that against my waistband. Yeah, so I decided that this was the right side. Okay. So I'm just going to lay it out. I'm just going to show you on one side here. So this is the crotch curve here, and this is the pocket edge. There's a notch down here and a notch up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pocket bags and I'm going to put them right sides together with the front piece. Like this. So this is the curve, this is the shape of that pocket opening. I'm going to place them right sides together. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this seam here with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And at the same time, I'm going to sew a piece of twill tape on. I'm going to take you to my sewing machine and demonstrate me doing that just so that it's a little bit easier for you to see. But over here, I'm just going to put some pins in it just to show you how it's going to go together. So I do find with tencel, because it's so slippery, it is very convenient to put some pins into it. There's nothing wrong with using pins. Using pins is not a sign of being good at sewing or being bad at sewing. It's just a sign of using pins. So whatever level of sewing you're at, I think you should just feel free to use pins. Okay, I'm going to take you to my sewing machine and show you how that's done. So the reason that we put the twill tape in is just to make sure that this pocket edge, which is quite long and it's cut slightly on the bias, so it doesn't stretch out while we're using it. Like, I think we've all had the experience of like a saggy, baggy pocket edge just bagging out, and it doesn't look very nice. So the twill tape really stabilizes that. Because there's a curve in this pocket piece, interfacing it really won't help that much. So twill tape is the right way to go. I'm going to show you two ways to do it. So here's the first way. The first way is the easier way, I think. It's to do it in two passes. This is a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm just going to sew this first. I have to be really careful because this is so shifty. Also being careful not to stretch it out. You don't want to stretch it out before you even had a chance to stabilize it. Okay, so I've sewed that, and then that was a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I'm going to sew it a second time. I'm going to sew my twill tape on. My goal is to get the twill tape into the seam allowance here, so I just kind of pop it down on top of here. You can pin it, but I don't find it actually helps a great deal. I'm just going to put my twill tape down, so hope you can see that. So the needle is just running along near the edge of the twill tape. It's got to catch the twill tape, but I don't want it to be going down the center of the twill tape, but I'm maintaining that 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm just basically sewing the seam a second time. Just find it's helpful to kind of lay it down just where I want it. There we go. So that's one way. I'm going to show you the other way now as well. Okay, so the other way is basically just doing it in one go. Maybe I'm foolish for doing it with this slippery tencel. Okay. I don't know if it's any quicker, to be honest. Probably you're handling it less, so it probably does help with not stretching it out, but you know, like, it's not a race. So that is the second way of doing it. Okay, it amounts to the same thing, it doesn't matter. Now, the next step is to grade and understitch. Just have to grab my scissors. Okay, now this fabric is pretty thin, but grading is always good. So when you grade a seam, basically what you're doing is you are see these two edges finished at the same spot. I want to reduce the amount of bulk that ends in any given spot. So I want to gradually trim back layer by layer, so it's like a kind of stepwise effect. The other thing that I like to keep in mind is where that seam bulk is going to end up. When it gets flipped through, this side will be the side closest to the outside of the garment. So I'm actually going to trim away this middle layer, which does suck a bit. So I'm just folding that twill tape back a bit, and I'm just trimming back just the middle layer of the seam allowance. Okay, things like grading and understitching really make a big difference to the finish of your garment. try not to cut into the twill tape. I mean, you want to maintain the integrity of the twill tape just because like it's there to stabilize it, so you don't want to cut into it. Just making sure I'm not cutting any of the important fabric. Not doing the best job trimming on camera, but that's okay. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to understitch. So understitching is where we're going to, we want the seam allowances to flip to the back of the garment. So in this case, we want to attach them to this pocket bag here. So this is the way I sewed it to start with, and I'm just going to flip the pocket bag over, and I'm going to make sure all the seam allowances are on the pocket bag side. So just neatly folding it under. You don't have to press, okay? Don't hear me saying that very often. So what I've done is I've just pulling the seam kind of gently apart. I'm kind of, because there's a curve here, I'm kind of moving it this way, making sure all the seam allowances are on the pocket bag side. And I'm running this edge of my presser foot along the seam line. Oh, whoops, forgot to do one more thing, sorry. Gotta clip this curve. It's too busy grading. So I'm not gonna clip the twill tape. I'm gonna clip this curve, just the curved bit. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, just making sure everything's out of the way. Okay, cool. So getting all of that seam allowance towards the pocket bag, opening the seam out and running that side of the presser foot along that stitching line, just folding it back to make sure all of the seam allowance is on this side. I can feel with my finger here that there's no seam allowance under there. So if there's no seam allowance, I'm good. I'm just gently pulling it apart with my fingers so that there's not like a tuck forming. Okay, you can feel that the seam allowance isn't quite there. There we go. So I'm sewing very close, like just like the width of a pin away from that first stitching line. Okay, this does the job of pressing at the same time. That's nice. There we go. So you can see just how close together that is. Now what it does is when I flip this to the back, it rolls this edge over. So it holds everything over, so you never see like this pocket bag poking out. It makes sure all of that stays behind really nicely like this. So I'm going to do the other one. I'm going to understitch the other one, grade, clip, and understitch the other one. And then I'm going to give it a gentle press. Make sure you don't press it too hard because you don't want any of the seam to show through. This is tencel and it marks really easily. Yet another reason that I find it very challenging to sew with. So I'll just have to treat it really carefully, and then I'll be back at my sewing machine and just show you how I'm going to top stitch that. Well, my iron decided to be a bit of a pain and drip some water, but fortunately no watermarks yet. Okay, so I have increased my stitch length to 3. So whenever you're doing top stitching or visible stitching, you want to increase your stitch length to 3 because the whole idea of top stitching is that you can see the stitches, like see the individual stitches, and you can't do that with a really short stitch length. So, I mean, our normal stitch length is 2.5, and our like top stitching one, or anytime it's like you want it to be seen, it's 3. So for top stitching, what I do is I'm just lining up this side of my presser foot against the edge of the fabric and just sewing it along there. So it's about 5 millimeters, just a little bit under a quarter of an inch. It's one of those things you just kind of get better at doing, both with controlling your machine and just guiding the fabric in. So you can see that's neat, and that's there was no need to finish all of those edges because now they're enclosed in there. So I'm going to do that on the other one, and then I'm going to do the next step. So I'll be back. Okay, so I flipped it over to the back side. Here's that pocket bag. Okay, we've got my iron drip there again. We've got our top stitching there. That's the right side. Okay, so you can see this curve here of the edge of the pocket bag. Now I'm going to take my pocket piece and I'm making sure that the right side of my pocket piece is facing down, because what's going to happen is we're going to sew this together, and when we flip it back, you'll actually see this part against your hip. So you might want to flip it over and just like double check that that it is the right side. So just lining this pocket and pocket bag up. Now the important thing is you're not going to sew it to the front. We're just going to sew just this pocket bag and the pocket together, keeping the front free. So I'm going to pin it in place. So slippery. Okay, slipping off my table. Okay, so I'm just gonna hold just that edge with the curve. We're just gonna sew this L-shaped piece with a curve. I'm gonna hold it so that the front is just like hanging free. And then we're going to sew that. Just a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance again. We don't need a big seam allowance for this. So I've sewn that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish it in the method that I'm choosing. I'm going to use my serger. You could also zigzag it on your sewing machine, or you could bind it, I suppose. So I'm going to do that and then be back for the next step. Great, and now we have something that looks like a total mess, right? Well, it's not. So what we're going to do is find this notch at the top. This notch should match up with the edge of your stitching here, and that should all lie nice and flat. I'm just going to pin it in place because we're going to stay stitch it, but when I pin it, you'll see it all come together and it will be great. Okay, so that's the top. Look, it's looking like pants. Okay, and that's the side here. I'm just going to turn it around. So there's another notch on the side here, and that notch matches with the lower edge of the pocket. I'm just going to trim that excess off. Your notches might not match perfectly. Don't sweat it. Just make the pocket lie nice and flat. Okay, so like if it was lying nice and flat, but it was like a little bit past this notch, it wouldn't matter at all. Just like, can you see here how this edge is just wants to lie a little bit past there? I'm going to let that happen because if I don't, it might gape. And I would rather, I just want it to be flat. So I'm just making sure it's all lying super flat. Okay. You should have a fully functioning pocket now. Notice that there's no stitching visible on this side. If you have stitching, then you've maybe sewn the pockets to the front of the pants somehow. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay stitch here and here, just to hold that pocket bag in place. So what stay stitching is just sewing just about 1/4 inch away from the edge, just to hold it together. But we do it within the seam allowance so that we can't see it later. So I'm going to do that on both of them. Okay, things are coming together. So the front is done. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my back pieces and I'm going to, actually, you know what, at this point, what I usually advise people to do is to lay your front pieces side by side to make sure that you have a left and a right front. And I know it sounds silly, but if you have a fabric like this, that's very, like where the right and wrong sides are really similar, it's easy to do. So I've got 2 pockets and they're like on opposite sides. So just check that that's the case. Okay, so then take your back piece and we're going to put the back piece on top of the front piece, right sides together. There we go. Ooh, so slippery. Okay, so right sides together. This is my side seam where the pocket is. I'm going to sew the side seam and I'm going to sew the inseam together. And that's going to be with a 1/2 inch or 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeter seam allowance. I'm just going to zoom you out a little bit so you can see a bit better. Okay, so this is that crotch curve there. And I'm just going to pin the inseams together. Be very careful when you're pinning the inseam that you're not stretching it. It's slightly on the bias, and so it has a tendency to want to stretch on us. And if you stretch it, it will cause all manner of difficulties in terms of things not fitting together. Just, it can like make it kind of sag out. It's not a good seam. So I'm going to pin this inseam. And I'm going to pin the side seam as well. Just going to turn it around to show you. Okay. So there's that pocket in there. I'm just going to pin it together. So laying it nice and flat. That stay stitching is really handy here because where there'd be like 4 layers to sew together, you only have to worry about the 2. Just make sure you keep that pocket out of the way when you're sewing. Pinning the side seams in. Oops. Just got for my pins. This seam shouldn't require any easing. Like, it should match up exactly. So if it doesn't, then there's an issue. Either, so just go check your pattern piece. Maybe it's stretched out a bit, something like that. But they should match exactly. Okay, so sew the inseam and the side seam on both the left and the right leg using a 1.3 centimeter or 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then what you'll do is you will finish those seams together. And what that means is instead of opening the seam up and finishing the 2 edges separately, you'll finish the 2 edges together and then press those seams towards the back. Well, it's the next day now, and it's very exciting because we have pants that kind of are starting to look like pants. Like, at this point, I would suggest giving it a really good press. But but you can see that the pockets are like fully functional pockets. So that's really exciting. So, you know, I've just pressed my side seams and my inseams. This is going to be the easiest time you can do it. This fabric really creases like crazy, but anyway, I have given it a press on the inseams and the side seams. Now what you're going to do, we're going to sew that crotch seam. So we're going to turn, one of the legs is going to be right way out and the other leg is going to be inside out. So one's going to be right side out, the other one's going to be inside out. So right now they're both right side out, so I'm going to turn this one inside out. Okay, and then, so this one's inside out. You're going to put the other leg, the leg that is the right way out, inside the leg that is inside out. So it's going to be right sides together. Just handling it fairly gently because I don't want to stretch out that crotch seam. Okay, so I'm just going to put match my crotch seam, so right sides together, and I like to just put a pin in there. I like to do it right on the stitching line. And that's because I'm a bit of a maniac about matching stitching lines. But, you know, honestly, yeah, you want to try and match it at the crotch, but is it the end of the world if it doesn't match? Like, I don't think so, because I don't think people are going to be, you know, really spending a lot of time looking there. Well, maybe they are, but so I'm just going to pin this crotch seam. We're going to sew this crotch seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so 1.3 centimeters. And then what I recommend is actually sewing it again a second time, about just a little bit more than that. So just slightly in the seam allowance, and all that's for is just like a safety net. So in case you know, sit down in a funny way and like the fabric's like caught under your butt in a bit of a way and like you pop one lot of stitches, you know, you then aren't going to pop both rows of stitches. So now these curves should match precisely as well, because they're actually the same piece that you've cut. So it's not like matching curves or anything. Now, I find it easiest to sew kind of from the inside, but, you know, do whatever works for you. Like, I like to sew it so that I'm sewing from the inside of the leg. That makes it easier for me. So I'm going to sew it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, 1.3 centimeters, and then a second time just at, say, 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter, and then I'm going to finish that seam together. Well, this is very exciting. We truly have something that is looking like a pair of pants. We're going to move on to the waistband now. So I actually did this step already, so I'm going to tell you what to do, and then you can pause the video and go do it. So as I said earlier in the video, I didn't have quite enough fabric for this pattern, so I already put a join in my waistband. So the next thing you're going to do is just say you didn't do the join. You can have a long strip of waistband, and you're going to put it right sides together and then sew the short ends together using a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then go ahead and press that open. Now the method of, there's 2 options for finishing your waistband in the pattern. I'm going to show you the one that I haven't shown in any other videos. So if you prefer to do the clean finish, which is where it's folded up neatly, I will link our other video to one of our other pants there where that's demonstrated. But I'm going to do the serged edge finish, which is a lot easier, to be honest. So I would recommend this only if you have a serger. A zigzagged edge just isn't going to hold up to the kind of wear and tear. So what I've done is I've pressed my seam open, and then I have serged one edge of the waistband. If you are doing the other one, you're going to have that folded up. Okay, I'm going to turn my pants inside out now. Just handling it gently. Because there's some shaping in the waist, because so it fits your body better, there's the chance that you could inadvertently stretch it out a little bit. So we don't want to do that. So just handle it with care. Of course, because I chose this ridiculous fabric. It's beautiful fabric, but it is tricky to sew. It does tend to stretch out more. So I'm going to take my seam and I'm going to match it to the center back seam of my pants. So I'm putting it right sides together. So the waistband's going on the inside and I'm just going to pin it together. Now, there shouldn't be ease in this waistband. However, as I said before, it does have a bit of a tendency to stretch out a bit just with this particular fabric, and also with just with it being cut slightly on the bias. Because I have that front seam as well, because I had to cut it in 2 pieces, I've got a waypoint to measure it against, and then I'm going to just go back and make sure it's all eased in properly. If you like, you can actually just put a little notch into your waistband to help you pin it evenly. So this is right sides together. Great. So I'm going to sew the waistband to the pants using a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then I'm going to press that seam upwards towards the waistband. Okay, so I have sewed the waistband on and pressed it up. Now at this point, we want to grade this seam a little bit. This is actually really thin fabric, so I may or may not do that if I weren't demonstrating, but I will do it because it's not going to hurt. So first of all, I like to just go around and cut off like any little ears like this, and I do that at an angle. So that's just the seam allowance as it's extended up into the waistband. And then usually what I do is I run my finger like between the 2 layers like this and just cut it back to about half of its width. Don't cut it too tight, like too close. You just want to reduce that bulk a little bit. Oopsie. Very slinky. Make sure you're not cutting any of the important fabric, just the seam allowance. If I were using anything any bulkier, I would definitely do this step. And it makes a big difference with how the waistband sits, because it's going to be bunched up with the elastic, if you imagine that, and it's only going to exacerbate any excess bulk there. And what that'll do is it'll just prevent the elastic from sitting really nicely. Now here's, I'm at my pocket, and there are quite a lot of layers here, so I just want to be good about my grading here. Because it's thinner fabric, I'm just gonna grade the pocket as as one. If it were thicker, I would kind of do each level, just each amount of seam layer at slightly different level, but this will be fine. It's not the most enjoyable thing, like it's not like super fun, but it's one of those things that really does level up your garment. Great. Okay. So, if you're going to use a label, now would be a good time to grab a hold of it. I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. Okay, so I have my waistband attached, and then this is the elastic I'm going to use. I really like this elastic. It's really firm and it doesn't roll, because you know we all hate it when elastic rolls. It's 1.5 inches wide. So what I suggest you do is, if you have a seam gauge, that's going to be really useful, is place the elastic, and I like to tuck it like behind this, this seam allowance here in the waistband, and then fold this down. So for this finish, you know, we're just going to fold it. I'm going to stitch here. But what I want to do is I just want to measure how much to press. So it's just going to sit there, and then I'm going to take, oopsie, I just caught something on the other side. There we go. So I'm just going to measure how much room it needs. And then I'm going to take my seam gauge. I'm just going to set it for the amount of space that needs, which is just about, it is a bit more than 1.5 inches because it needs a bit of space there. So now I'm going to unpin that, take my piece of elastic out, and I'm going to press this waistband to the inside using my seam gauge as a guide for how much to do that. At this point, you can also add your label at the center back. So you would add it just on the one layer like this, and just make sure that it's going to hit, like make sure it's not down here unless you want it to be one that's hanging down below. If you want it to be in the waistband like this, then sew it on just a single layer of fabric like that. Or you can sew on one of the ones that kind of hangs down. So I'm going to press it and then come back. Okay, so I've pressed it, you know, my generous 1.5 inches. And on the inside, you know, because I'm doing this method, it's just going to be that raw edge. So when it's finished, it's going to have this serged edge, which is perfectly comfortable and fine. So the next step is to sew this casing in. Now we have to leave a little gap so we can thread the elastic, and to do that, what I like to do is just put 2 vertical pins, like like a do not sew zone, so I know to leave this part unsewn. And then, you know, whenever I'm stitching in the ditch, and stitching in the ditch is where we're going to sew right in the crack, right in the crack between where the waistband joins on and where the pants are. We're going to sew right in there. And if you don't get it all the way perfectly aligned, it actually doesn't matter, because it's going to be a bit gathered there because of the elastic. So, you know, don't sweat it if you go a little bit, you know, have a little bit of a jog up into the waistband a tiny bit, or, you know, vice versa, like you accidentally go down into the pants just by, you know, just a titch. It's not important, okay? It's not going to detract from like the beauty of your pants. So yeah, don't sweat it. So just go around and pin it, always making sure that all of the waistband seam allowances are still up in the waistband. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So that's right in this crack here, all the way around, leaving that gap. I'm gonna do that and be back. I just thought I'd pop on here. I'm mid-sew, just so you can see what it looks like when you're stitching in the ditch. So I've got, I can see where the needle is going to be landing, which is right in that ditch. I find that it's helpful actually to actually look just here. I don't try and look where it's sewing, because where it's sewing, it's, you know, too late basically. So I try to look just about here is where I kind of aim my eyes. Taking out the pins as I go, and then I'm just kind of smoothing it out, making sure everything's sitting right. And I like to just like pop a finger there, or a thumb. And then I'm kind of I only do this for ditch stitching, where I'm just pulling it apart ever so slightly. My sewing machine has a function where I can select if it's going to stop with the needle in the up or the down position. I find it's helpful to have it stop in the down position myself. Oh, I have run out of bobbin thread. So at that point, I'm going to turn my camera off, wind some more bobbin thread, and show you the next step. Okay, so that's been sewn in the ditch, and you really can't see it. But even if you don't get it right in the ditch, it's fine too. On the inside, you can see it's still a really nice finish, just with that line of stitching and the serging there. Okay, here's where I left that gap for elastic threading. So I've cut this piece of elastic to fit quite firmly on my high waist. Like, I just find that, you know, I never do it quite firm enough. So I've cut it to length, and I like to use, this is just a diaper pin, nappy pin. I like to use that, and I find it helps to just cut these ears off the end of the elastic. So I cut it like maybe about this much too long. And I'm just gonna insert the elastic into the casing and just use the safety pin to thread it in. You just want to be careful that you don't suck the other end in. So as I'm gathering it in there, I just kind of give it a gentle pull. What I actually really like to do is I like to hold this end in my teeth. So I'm doing that now. Just making sure you're not twisting it as you go. Okay, so I'm going to thread it in all the way, and then I'm going to join the ends together. And then I'm going to ditch stitch up that little gap. So I'll do that, and then what you'll do is you can either finish this hem edge and then turn it up and top stitch it. It's got a 1-inch hem allowance, or you can turn it twice. So turn it once about this much, and then the second time, and then either top stitch it or hand stitch it down. So anyway, I hope that this sew along was helpful.